Gentlemen, it's a pleasure to welcome you to Disrupt Sydney 2017. My name is Greg Whitwell. I'm the Dean of the University of Sydney Business School. Our theme this year is Imagining the Future. And if you subscribe to the Business School's podcasts on Sydney Business Insights, and I certainly hope each and every one of you do, then you'll be aware of Kai and Sandra's series on the future this week, and clearly these are people who are preoccupied with the future. But if we turn to our heritage for a moment, I would like to remind you that we are meeting today on sacred land, and I'd like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land upon which we're meeting, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I was unable to be here last year, but I did provide a brief and somewhat silly video introduction to the forum. However, I was here 2 years ago, and I did speak rather more seriously and rather critically about the way in which the word disruption has become almost ubiquitous and applied, in my view, without discretion. And I suggested, perhaps somewhat flippantly, that it was time to disrupt disruption. Looking back on that, and it's only 2 years ago, I think it's quite remarkable the extent to which there has been a change in popular discourse. So that for many people, disruption has been replaced by dystopia. And much of the discussion about a future dystopia is about the way in which robotics, artificial intelligence, machine learning, computerization, automation more generally, will have a profoundly negative effect on how many jobs will exist in the future. Martin Ford's seminal work, and the 2015 winner of the Financial Times and McKinsey Business Book of the Year Award, has the title, The Rise of the Robots, Technology and the Threat of Mass Unemployment. Stick with the Financial Times for a minute. I read it every day. Consider some of the headlines from just the last week or so. Starting with this one. Robot shock threatens the most vulnerable communities. Interesting piece, looking at some work by David Oater, which I'd like to talk about when I have the opportunity. Here's another one. Half of all British jobs could be replaced by robots, warns Bank of England chief economist. And just to pay homage to the other side of the Atlantic, a day or two later, we have this headline, robots threaten jobs of bankers' lawyers, Bank of America says. This one, teachers have 10 years before robots take over, University Vice-Chancellor. That was a UK Vice-Chancellor announcing this, not an Australian one. And one more, AI invasion will allow workers to empathise, problem solve and adapt. And that headline is especially intriguing for me, not only because of the contradictory suggestion that AI will allow us to do what I think is already a uniquely human thing, namely the ability to empathise. But it's also intriguing because of the use of the word invasion. Indeed, much of the language, I think, to describe a gloomy robotic future has a tendency to suggest that robots will somehow by themselves rise up. In fact, they may be coming through the door just now and take us over. That is, in fact, a robot. God knows how many articles are now headed, "The robots are coming." Our fate, apparently, to borrow the title of a recent article in Wired magazine, is that we will descend into a robo-apocalypse. In fact, the full title of that particular article in Wired magazine was a play on words of Apocalypse Now. And the full title was Robo-Apocalypse Not. The suggestion there was that people's anxiety about the possibility of mass unemployment caused by automation is misplaced. I can't help but think that the seminal piece that helped set off the current fascination with the possibility, indeed the likelihood as it's portrayed in the press, of potentially millions upon millions of jobs disappearing in the future, was the study released by two academics from Oxford University in 2013, Frey and Osborne, in which they declare that 47% of total US employment was at risk within the next 2 decades of disappearing. Of course, there have been subsequent studies. The OECD, for example, released a study which was rather more sanguine and suggests that the figure was closer to 10%. Other studies have taken a more refined and nuanced approach and focused not so much on jobs, but on the likelihood of the different tasks that make up jobs being automated. I think in making sense of these studies, an underlying issue is whether we are underestimating or overestimating the pace and the dramatic effects of technology, at least compared to the technology revolution of the last century. Let me come back to that. Let me remind you of today's theme, Imagining the Future. There's a very nice collection of articles that were published in a book that came out earlier this year by The Economist, and it had the title Megatech, Technology in 2050. And as the title suggests, and I think there are about 20 authors in the book, each of them has a go at trying to imagine the future, in this case, the future as of 2050. And it makes for intriguing reading. Throughout, there is a tendency in some chapters either to see the future as offering two extremes, or in other chapters to offer for every positive possibility a warning that things might go terribly, terribly wrong. For example, one of the chapters looks at fundamental physics, and it talks about the brilliant opportunities created by technology for creativity in the service of human needs and inspiring prospects, I'm quoting, for achieving new levels of material wealth and spiritual enrichment. But then quickly talks about the potential dangers of nuclear war, ecological collapse, and artificial intelligence warfare. There's some wonderfully intriguing thoughts in the book about biological developments, including the possibility of our brains being plugged into the internet, God forbid, and our used body parts being swapped for new ones, which you might suggest is already happening. But again, quite rightly, the discussion turns to the profound ethical questions that such developments would entail. Of course, you can imagine the future on an industry-by-industry basis, and one of the most fascinating industries, I think, is farming. And one of the authors in the Megatech book is confident that we will be able to feed a planet of nearly 10 billion people by the year 2050 because of the development of techniques such as the application to plants of precise gene editing tools that could turbo boost photosynthesis to make crops faster and dramatically improve yields. Furthermore, so-called urban fishing farms could bring the sea to the city and make fish the dominant source of animal protein. And another possibility is that animal products, steak, milk, and eggs without shells, will be grown from cell culture without any actual animals. What you should be asking will happen in healthcare, what might happen in the energy industry. Certainly I know what I would like to happen. What kinds of material revolutions will continue in manufacturing? One of the authors suggests that in 2050, AR glasses will have replaced smartphones. Conversations with people who speak other languages will be simultaneously translated, and best of all for me, who really needs people always, including my closest colleagues, to wear name tags because I'm so bad with names, you will never forget someone's name because everything you know about a person will appear as you talk to them. God, I hope they don't know everything about me. That would be quite frightening. But again, there's a flipping from the bright side to the dark side, and questions arise about whether ultra-intelligent machines pose an existential threat to the human race. Is it the case, one of the authors suggests, that it's not the machines that will be the problem, but rather the humans who create the environment for them? And while some people talk about the way in which technology, by creating potentially mass unemployment, will in turn lead to a dire world of even worse inequality, others argue that technology could in fact reduce inequality, for example, by helping to detect and select youngsters regardless of their social background. I won't go on, but there's that theme always, and I'll be intrigued with today's discussion about whether we go into a dystopian or a utopian view, or whether you think the future lies somewhere in between. But if Kai will indulge me just a few more minutes, I'd like to refer to one specific chapter in the book, and it's by Tom Standage. And he talks about 3 tools that help us to imagine the future. And essentially these tools are about drawing on accounts of the past, the present, and the future of technology. To deal with first, and I'm going to talk about this because my training originally was in economic history, the study of history is something that can be used to predict the future of technology, or at least make slightly more educated guesses about it. And what Standage argues is that historical analogies make it possible to foresee the social and cultural impact of new inventions, and they help also to put skepticism into perspective. They provide clues about how technology might evolve in future, and they provide a reminder that the problems blamed on new technologies are often the result of human nature. History is being used, I should add, not only to draw insights into the future, but also to put the present impact of contemporary technologies into perspective. And the key contributor here is a guy called Robert Gordon, who argues that the digital revolution is impressive, but in fact it has had and will continue to have relatively limited transformative potential, at least when compared with the great innovations of the second half of the 19th century. Consider these arguments from Martin Wolf. Over the past 2 centuries, historic breakthroughs have been responsible, he says, for generating huge unmeasured value. The motor vehicle eliminated vast quantities of manure from urban streets, one of Sandra Peter's preoccupations. The refrigerator prevented food from becoming contaminated. Clean running water and vaccines delivered drastic declines in child mortality rates. The introduction of running water, gas and electric cookers, vacuums and washing machines helped liberate women from domestic labour. The telephone removed obstacles to speedy contact with the police, fire brigades and ambulance services. The discovery of electric light eliminated forced idleness. Central heating and air conditioning ended discomfort. The introduction of the railroad, the steamship, the motor car and the airplane annihilated distance. He also argues that the radio, the gramophone and the television alone did far more to revolutionise home entertainment than the technologies of the past 2 decades have. And let me quote him, because this is a really nice quote that I like. He says this: the reason we are impressed by the relatively paltry innovations of our own time is that we take for granted the innovations of the past. By the same logic, we may exaggerate the extent of change in the future. Kai, I'll be about 2 minutes. Because I want to just mention the other two. One of them is the way in which we can look at the present. And one of my favourite quotes is from William Gibson, who of course is a science fiction writer. And he declared, "The future is already here. It's just not very evenly distributed," which ties in with, I think, an important point, namely that technologies have a very long gestation period, with the result that if you look in the right places, as Standage puts it, you can see tomorrow's technologies today. Where you probably need to look is what is sometimes referred to as the edge cases, the examples of technology and behaviours that are adopted by particular groups from particular countries before going on to become widespread. But looking at the edge cases, I think is a challenge in its own right, and it's more art than science. And of course, some technologies never take off, and far too many fall prey to the fallacies of the hype index, which leaves me to the third way of imagining the future, and that's by virtue of science fiction in whichever media you like. One of the wonderful things about science fiction is that it can play, I think, a salutary role in asking us to think about, for example, what might happen if nanotechnology or biotechnology got out of control, or genetic self-modification became as commonplace as tattoos. And what he argues, Standage, is that science fiction is not merely predictive, but it also inspires technologists to invent things. And anyone who is a devotee of Star Trek would be aware of how many inventions have come out of, I think, the inspiration of Star Trek. But he makes this really interesting point. He says that although sci-fi is outwardly about the future in most cases, almost by definition, it's really about the present and responds to contemporary ideas and concerns such as an overdependence on machines or worries about environmental destruction. And one of the things he says is that if you read a lot of sci-fi, what it does is it gives you greater mental flexibility. I like that idea. To envisage future scenarios, both technological and societal. But, and this is a very important but, it can also unwittingly constrain, because it will shape technical developments and how they're perceived and how they're discussed. And he finishes with this bit of advice, as will I, Kai. It's worth reading, he says, classic sci-fi from the mid-20th century to see what it gets wrong and why, and then ask yourself what mistaken assumptions are being made by today's tales. So ladies and gentlemen, I've gone on way too long, but it's all too easy to be intrigued by the theme of this forum. I wish you all the best in imagining the future, and never forget to quote that famous line, the future is not what it used to be. Thank you very much.